We are now this week doing our second of 5 sessions on the Small Catechism for Adults. As in previous week, you will have opportunity to look at and to stop and answer questions. Just pause the recording at the appropriate place. The questions will appear on the screen, and I'll give you time to talk, and then we will start it back up again to continue. Last week, you may recall that we talked about the 2 tablets of the law. The first tablet, the one you see here on my left, your right, has 3 numbers. That is the first 3 commandments. And those deal with our relationship with God, that vertical piece of what is a cross-filled life. The second tablet deals with the 7 commandments that follow. And those commandments deal with our relationship with one another, the vertical aspect of the horizontal aspect of our relationships, those who are to the right and to the left of us. Remember that Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and mind. That's the upright cross piece. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the right and to the left of that cross piece. And that all the laws, all the commandments could be comprised in those 2. We live at the cross piece where those 2 relationships meet, and they inform one another. The vertical one, the one that between us and God, informs and controls and shapes the horizontal relationships we have with friends and family and wives and brothers and sisters and children. And we're going to talk a little bit about Lutheran ethics. That is, how shall we live together? How do these 2 relationships inform and strengthen and guide and constrain one another? And the word ethics comes from a Greek word ethos, which means life. How do we live our lives? The 4th commandment, you shall honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land. What does this mean? It means that we should fear and love God so that we do not despise our parents or superiors, nor provoke them to anger, but honor, serve, obey, love, and esteem them. This is, as the Bible says, the only commandment that has a promise attached, and Luther picked this up as well. And as we go through these commandments, one thing I want you to notice is that Luther not only deals with the prohibitions, what you should not do, thou shalt not, but also, as a way of keeping these commandments, what you should do. And here, honor, serve, obey, love, and esteem. And this is a pattern that Luther will continue throughout all the commandments. Our scripture that informs us today is from Ephesians 6, verses 1 to 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it will be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Let's take a look at our first video.
The 4th commandment, you are to honor your father and mother. The 10 commandments are divided into 2 tables. The first one has to do with our relationship with God. The second one has to do with our relationship with everyone else. In the second table of commandments, God is giving us a framework so we can live long and happy lives. The very first relationship he gives us a framework for is our relationship with our parents. He commands us to honor our parents. Now, when we talk about honoring our parents, all sorts of things might pop into your mind. Things like, sounds good in theory, but God didn't really mean my parents, did he? Martin Luther had a very honest view about parents and parenting. In fact, Luther said that at times, parenting was one generation of fools raising the next. Nonetheless, Luther wrote that motherhood and fatherhood are the highest walks of life. So high that God commands us to honor our parents, not just love them. We often think that love is the ultimate expression of a relationship. But God is telling us that honor, not love, is higher and more important. So, what exactly does God mean when he says we're to honor our parents? Is calling my mom on her birthday enough? When God tells us to honor our parents, he means first of all to love our parents, but he also means that we should treat them in a certain way, with respect, humbleness, and gratitude. And the kind of respect God is talking about means we don't argue with, don't question, or criticize our parents. This is how important parents are to God. Now, this doesn't mean that parents are allowed to be mean or dangerous or to hurt their children. That would be an abuse of the authority God gives parents over their children. If that happens, God provides other people to step in and help. People like pastors, teachers, or even police officers and judges. In other words, this is a two-way street. Children honor their parents, and parents raise their children in safe, loving homes. And so God gives us our parents, and He gives us our children, and He commands us not to merely love them, but to honor them. This is most certainly true.
I might point out that, generally speaking, when we receive advice from someone, you want someone who's had experience. For example, the Ephesians passage written by St. Paul, written by a confirmed bachelor who never had a child or had to live in a marital relationship. So you want to know, what in the world does he know about raising a family? Same thing might have been said of Luther when he was a Catholic priest. But Luther did get married Kate von Bora. He did have children. He not only knew the joys and the challenges of raising children and the joys and the challenges of being a parent, he also knew the sorrow, the profound sorrow. His 12-year-old daughter Magdalena died during one of the multitudinous plagues that broke out during Luther's life. He grieved for that child to his dying day. So Luther understood, not just intuitively and theologically, but viscerally what these relationships were like. And I think that just as we talk about how God can understand our sorrow, being himself a parent who gives up a child, you can also say that Luther understood God's sorrow at having to lose a child as well. Well, here's some questions. Take a look at them. Take some time to discuss them, and after you've had opportunity to discuss them, have your pastor or a group leader pause this video and then come back and start it again. We'll go on to the next commandment. I'll give you 5 seconds to make that pause. Okay. The 5th commandment, you shall not kill. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do no bodily harm to our neighbor, but help and befriend him in every need. You shall not kill. Sounds so simple. I've had young people in confirmation say to me, well, we may not do so well with the other 9 commandments, but this one, boy, we got this one down pat. I haven't killed anybody. But I think you realize that it's never that simple. And in point of fact, if you read Luther's explanation to this commandment, in particular in the large catechism, you'll discover that the many and various ways that he lists for us to kill somebody, to kill their reputation, to kill their livelihood, to do things that damage their lives and perhaps to make their lives permanently bad. We are involved in all of those things as well. And also, was pointed out in our discussion on Sunday, the Bible is full of examples of where God commands people to kill. The Old Testament, the conquest by Joshua, where he was required to kill everybody, of the enemy. And we know that there was capital punishment. There was all kinds of things that went on in the Old Testament, as there are today. The Hebrew language from which this is derived has about 4,500 words. That's a very small number of words. By comparison, the Greek language has somewhere in the range of 60,000 words. To give you a comparison today, your English language that we speak has somewhere between 800 and 900,000 words, which is why our language is so difficult to learn. Because if we don't have a good word for something, we make it up. In the Hebrew, the word for kill we served a whole bunch of purposes because they only had the one. And that's why often you'll see this transcribed as murder, as you will see, for example, in this text from Matthew. Matthew 5:21-22, which is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, translated from the Greek. You see here now the language is a more sophisticated language. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. And whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So you see here, even Jesus is expanding this definition of what it means to harm someone in a way that can be very discomforting. Well, let's take a look at the video.
The 5th commandment, you are not to kill. In the 4th commandment, God set a framework for the relationships we have in our home with our family. Now, the 5th commandment extends that framework, moving us out of our house and into our neighborhood. The 5th commandment is short and sweet, but as Martin Luther knew, these simple words mean much more than what appears on the surface. While killing is the main concern in this commandment, the root of the problem is far more complex. What leads to killing is a whole host of other sins. Wishing we had what someone else has, being frustrated with our place in life, or being angry at being treated wrongly are negative and harmful feelings that make us want to undermine our neighbor's well-being and life. It isn't uncommon for people to hear the fifth commandment and think they haven't broken it. But as Jesus says in Matthew 5, this commandment is a lot deeper than you might think. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. Luther summarizes it this simply: we can murder with hand, heart, or word. There are two sides to this commandment. God sets a limit, and he gives us ways to help our neighbors. So you might be asking, well, who is my neighbor, and how do I know how to help them? Simply put, your neighbor is the people you interact with on a daily basis. Family, friends, co-workers, people you see in the grocery store. This doesn't even begin to talk about the neighbors you don't even know who live in other states or other countries. They all have needs too. Such demands from God can feel overwhelming. Does God really expect me to help the whole world? The question actually exposes the heart of our problem. Worrying about our ability to help others and what we should do reveals we are not trusting God to give us all we need. When we trust God, we are free to give to others who need our help. Remember the promise of the first commandment, "I am the Lord your God." You have a God who helps, comforts, protects, and provides for you all that you need. This is most certainly true.
Jesus told a story in response to the question, who is my neighbor? Luke 15, when he talks about the Good Samaritan. The lawyer wants to know, who is my neighbor? Jesus tells him the story of the man on his way from Jericho to Jerusalem who gets waylaid, who gets mugged and is left for dead. And two people pass by him, a priest and a Levite, because they're going up to Jerusalem. And the only reason you went up to Jerusalem by that road was because you either lived there, or in the case of these two, they were going to worship there. And if you go up to Jerusalem to fulfill the commandment that you must go once a year to the temple and pay homage and make a sacrifice, if you touched a dead body, you were ritually impure, unclean. You could not go into the holy precincts. It would defeat the purpose of your trip. So they were just trying to keep God's law here in the strictest possible way. The third one that comes by is a Samaritan, and he picks him up and dusts him off and takes him to an inn. And Jesus says, now who acted as a neighbor to the man? And the answer the man said, the lawyer said was, well, I guess the one who showed him mercy. And he was referring to the Samaritan, but he didn't say Samaritan. And I want you to point to remember that the Samaritan would never go up to Jerusalem to worship. The Samaritan worshipped someplace else. He worshipped on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim up near the town of Shechem in the middle of the country. He didn't believe the temple was the place where God was to be worshipped. Go to John chapter 4. You see that conversation between the woman at the well of Samaria and Jesus. You know, your ancestors worship in Jerusalem, mine worship here. This was not the case for him. He was not afraid to be ritually impure. So there was no issue for him at all. He could see the man truly for who the man was, a victim of violence, and therefore was able to be the neighbor to him. Sometimes what we think these stories are about is not what they are about. And that's what this is about. Jesus turns up the heat, so to speak, as our first question asks. So take some time to look at these questions, discuss them. Again, I'll give you 5 seconds to turn the machine off, and then when we get back here, we'll continue on. Okay, the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Well, what does this mean? We should fear and love God, so that we lead a chaste and decent life in word and deed, and that husband and wife each love and honor the other. And once again, Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The famous admission by President Jimmy Carter in, of all places, Playboy magazine. Yeah. Well, that's another story for another day. But here, once again, we have Jesus taking what seems like a very difficult thing and making it even worse. And let me tell you something else that's difficult, and that's to teach this particular commandment to a group of junior high kids. They have no concept at all of fidelity in marriage or even marriage. And the whole notion of adultery is so fraught with sexual overtones that you can barely talk about it. Now, I recall when I was growing up, there was 10 pictures that we had on the wall of the Sunday school that showed that each of the 10 commandments, and they were designed for children. And what do you think they showed when this commandment was displayed? Thou shalt commit no adultery. And it was a picture of somebody pouring out spoiled milk. Because there's no doubt in your mind when milk is spoiled. When a little bit of milk goes spoiled, the whole jerry can is spoiled. There's no such thing as just the top of the milk being spoiled, the bottom. Spoiled milk is spoiled milk, and it's not good for anything, unless of course you add some culture to it, and then it can become yogurt or cottage cheese, I guess. But in the main, spoiled milk is only good to be thrown away. It ruins it, and that's what adultery does. It ruins something. It makes something that is good and sweet and wholesome and right, and it ruins it. It looks the same on the outside. Spoiled milk looks like good milk, but you taste it, you smell it, then you can tell that it's bad. That's what this is. Adultery is something that destroys relationships, and not just between husbands and wives. That's the obvious place. But adultery, unfaithfulness in this case, is what can destroy relationships between friends, between families, in churches, between you and God. All of these relationships are always at risk. And when you commit an act of unfaithfulness, you are putting not just yourself, but the relationship of all those others at risk as well. Let's take a look at the video.
The sixth commandment. You are not to commit adultery. Just as God is concerned about protecting us in our homes and neighborhoods, God is also concerned about protecting us in our most intimate relationship, marriage. From the very beginning, when God created man and woman, God showed his concern for marriage. When he commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, he established the purpose for marriage, to bear children and provide a stable home for them to grow up in. God knows the foundation of a stable home is healthy relationships built on trust. Not only is trust necessary for a stable home, it's also the centerpiece of all healthy relationships. The more intimate the relationship, such as marriage, the greater the trust. When infidelity occurs, trust is broken and marriage can be destroyed. This is why God gives us the sixth commandment, to protect our marriages as well as our families. When people think of infidelity, the physical aspect of the relationship is the first thing that comes to mind. When Jesus talks about adultery, he goes much further. Jesus' words reveal that the root of our sin is much deeper than most people think. The problem is in our heart. What's in the heart can result in harmful actions that destroy trust in our relationships. In fact, Jesus is talking about all people, not just married people. Because we all have close relationships, God is setting limits on these relationships and giving us boundaries. In addition to setting a limit, God is also providing something for us, a solid center out of which our relationships with one another, in society, in family, and in marriage can thrive. The sixth commandment centers on our relationships so that trust can be established and maintained. It's with this in mind that God places a strict limit on the ways we express our love, so that when we live in this world of relationships, we live in trust with one another, in homes that are stable and secure, and in marriages that are full of honor, trust, and love. This is most certainly true.
Quite often in the Bible, when God wants to talk about relationships, he talks about the people or the organizations to which he is related are bonded to him like a wife or like a bride that is spotless and pure. And Jesus in particular used the image of a wedding to talk about that ideal of the relationship between God and his people. So this is an important concept. But when we talk about weddings in our day and age, we need to be very careful. The notion of a biblical marriage is reflected in the sixth commandment, but the reality of marriage in our society in no way, shape, or form is based upon the issue of fidelity. Fidelity we see as kind of a blessing or a good luck piece or whatever, but it's certainly not as central. It's contract that is central to our understanding of marriage. And it's where us and the state find common cause is to keep the contract of marriage alive and viable. And I'll point out as offer as proof that no longer is infidelity a grounds for divorce. It just won't get you there. Infidelity might be a reason for your divorce, but they morph it into some kind of a legal reason, irreconcilable differences, whatever. No fault divorce is the more common one. So I'm just saying is that the discussion for marriage is for another time, but we need to be careful, and I think way more intentional than we've been in the last, especially 20 years, 10 years, even the last 5 years, as we talk about marriage as a people of faith, as to what it is we mean by marriage, and what it is we hold dear and a value in the heart and the center of marriage. Because trust me when I tell you, sexuality, relational stuff, contract, that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about fidelity, and that's a very broad word, and a very broad moral issue. And as you can see here in this explanation of the commandment, that's the way Luther felt as well. Now, here's some questions about the commandment. Take some time to discuss them. Pause the video and then turn it back on when you're ready. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay. The 7th commandment, you shall not steal. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not take our neighbor's money or goods, nor get them in any dishonest way, but help him to improve and protect his goods and means of making a living. Our video.
The 7th commandment, you shall not steal. It may surprise you to hear that God likes things, material things. After all, He's the creator of all things, including you. As your creator, He gives you what you need to survive: food, clothing, somewhere to live. And that's why He's forbidden anyone from stealing these things from you. These things don't just show up out of thin air. Rather, God uses the relationships we have with one another to provide for our daily needs. So we have farmers, store owners, bankers, and many other jobs that form the economy, all helping us provide for one another. A healthy economy requires neighbors trusting one another. But such trust doesn't exist when we're worried about a thief lurking in the shadows. Martin Luther recognized burglars and bank robbers aren't the only ones who steal. Thieves are also people who run a dishonest business. Luther recognized that stealing is more common than you might think. We're stealing when we try to get more from our neighbor than we're willing to give them in return, or when we try to save our property for ourselves because we're afraid for the future. Now, if you think you can avoid breaking this commandment by not participating in the economy, that won't work either. Jesus is rather critical of the servant who buries his money instead of investing it in the economy. So if God is interested in things, but He doesn't want us to be hoarders, what can you do? Simply put, use the things God gives you to help your neighbor. One way we do this is by improving and protecting property, not only ours, but also our neighbors. You see, out of His great love for us, God gives us material things to be gifts in our lives and in the lives of our neighbors. And so, He gives this word of command in order to establish and maintain trusting relationships with our neighbors, so we can enter into and thrive in the economy of this world. This is most certainly true.
If you want to look at a Bible passage that was referenced in the video, Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. I'll say again, Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. It's the story of the householder that goes away and leaves talents or amounts of money with each of 3 servants. One he gives 5, one he gives 2, one he gives 1. And what they do with it, and how Jesus then, in the telling of this story, judges their efforts. It informs this commandment, I think, and that was referenced in your video. Now I'll give you some time to take a look at these questions, and they're quite complex, so I'm going to give you take as much time as you want or need to talk them through. As always, I'll give your group leader about 5-6 seconds to go and pause the machine, and then you can start it back up again. He or she can start it back up again as we continue our study. Okay. The 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, so that we do not lie about, betray, or slander our neighbor, but excuse him, speak well of him, and put the best construction on everything. This is one of those Lutheran ethical considerations that I think holds us in good stead, and one that's hard for us to hold to, putting the best possible construction on everything that our neighbor says or does. We always seem to want to think worse of our neighbor and not best. Luther tells us that bearing false witness is about us being blameless going into any conversation. Being blameless means, as you might say, that Luther believes it's better for us to be naive than to be more right than wrong. Wrong is wrong, and we should never willingly seek to be wrong. And so if we're not 100% sure of what we're saying, we should either say nothing at all, or we should try to defend our neighbor by putting the best possible construction on what he or she does. Matthew 18:15-17 is a way in which Jesus provided for communities of faith, in particular the church, to deal with difficult people in difficult circumstances. Every ELCA constitution has this passage embedded in it as the process by which councils and pastors and leaders are required to follow before we discipline one of our members. I read, "If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you've regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector."
The 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. In the 2nd commandment, God makes it clear that he doesn't want his name dragged through the mud. God is equally concerned about your name. He doesn't want your name to be slimed either. Why not? If you've ever found yourself in the situation of being put on trial, you can understand why God gave us the 8th commandment. Now, trials come in many forms. Trials happen in a courtroom or in a principal's office. They happen in a job interview and on the school playground. Each of these situations has something in common. You are being judged, and your reputation is at stake. Of course, being judged is not necessarily a bad thing. You may land a job or receive a letter of recognition because of it. But there is judgment that's not helpful. In fact, it can be downright harmful when it's misleading or simply false. God is well aware that the tongue is one of the most effective weapons for hurting people. Thus, he prohibits gossiping and lying. Our lives are dependent upon healthy relationships built on trust. When we're the target of gossip and lies, the weight of those words can undermine our lives the next time we find ourselves in a job interview or at a community gathering. As you know, the words we use can help our neighbor as much as they hurt. The most effective way to help is to put everything they do in a positive light. This is how we build and maintain trust in relationships with one another. How so? When we face the trials of life, in a courtroom, playground, or even within our own homes, we can live without wondering if we're being dealt with honestly. So God gives us a word in this commandment that fosters and preserves good relationships with one another and a healthy community. This is God's will, that our lives be filled abundantly with respectful and loving relationships. This is most certainly true.
In this day and age of social media and almost instant gratification to get things off of our chest, we Christians, really, particularly we Christians, have got to do a better job of adhering to and lifting up the values of this commandment. Christians are supposed to tell the truth, but they're supposed to tell the truth in love. What that means is that every truth we speak is not of itself a valuable truth. When it goes out and tears people down and slays them to the bone, that kind of truth may or may not be what God wants. What God wants is us to speak words that build one another up, not words that tear one another down. And sometimes telling the truth is another way of us saying we're going to get something off our chest and that's your problem, deal with it. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. And we have to acknowledge the wrongness of that. And we have to start holding ourselves accountable and then holding the world accountable because this is a day and age of fake news and just utter crap gets passed around through our email inboxes and our social media boxes and in just a variety of ways every day. Politics is just the worst of it, but it is by no means the beginning or the end of it. We have got to do better. Well, here's some questions that relate to the eighth commandment. Please feel free to discuss those. Pause the video at this point, and you can start up again in about 6-7 seconds. Okay. Luther, or I say our presenters here, put these commandments together because they're both about the same thing about coveting. That is, wanting something that you don't have, that doesn't belong to you. So there are two commandments, the ninth and the 10th commandments. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, the ninth. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not craftily seek to gain our neighbor's inheritance or home, nor get it by a show of right, but help and serve him in keeping it. I believe that should be show of might, but I'll have to double check that. The 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his cattle, nor anything that is his. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not tempt, force, or coax away from our neighbor his wife or his workers, but urge them to stay and do their duty. The 9th commandment is about things, and the 10th commandment is about relationships, and both of them are about wanting things that we do not have. Note the 10th commandment in particular doesn't just talk about you acquiring something, but rather you coaxing away somebody from somebody else. So here, the issue of fidelity in marriage, friendships, workers, all of these things, the ethical considerations here are deep and abiding and difficult, and we need to talk about these things, especially in the world and in the economy in which we live. Matthew 15:19, for out of the heart comes evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, and slander. Jesus' words, something we need to take to heart. Let's watch the video.
The 9th and 10th commandments. You shall not covet. Have you ever heard the saying, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence? This saying is well known because it identifies how often we're dissatisfied with the side of the fence we're on. Being dissatisfied leads us to dream about, wish, and hope for a different life than that which God has given us. This is precisely what the 9th and 10th commandments are addressing. How so? You see, coveting is wanting what we don't have. It's the beginning of a vicious cycle. When we want what we don't have, we're never satisfied with what we do have. So, how do you know if you're coveting? Well, one of the telltale signs is that I wish frequently comes out of your mouth. I wish I had a better car. I wish I had a better body. I wish I lived in a certain neighborhood or had a more prestigious job. Our lives become consumed by desires, what we wish we had. Watch the latest commercial trying to convince you that your life will be changed and made better if you buy their product. Advertisers are experts at convincing you they can help you be who you wish to be. God knows that when we covet, when we're jealous of what someone else has, that's the first step towards breaking the other commandments. In fact, when life becomes about fulfilling our desires, our attention is on ourselves and not on what other people need from us. But remember, God can be just as jealous as anyone. As he says in Exodus, you shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. He wants your heart all for himself, but make no mistake, this is not a matter of God being selfish. Rather, God wants your heart so as to give you rest from the constant desire for what you don't have. When our hearts are in God and not in false hopes and desires, we have peace with God and with our neighbors. So God speaks his word through these commandments, taking direct aim at our selfish desires and wishes, at all of our false hopes. God wants us to know that we have the one true God who places us in this life, providing for us all that we need on a daily basis. This is most certainly true.
Notice how in the presentation of these last 7 commandments, the second table of the law, that they continue to refer back to how the first 3 commandments, the first table of the law, inform all of these ethical considerations. These 2 tablets of the law are in conversation with one another. There's a dialogue going on, a tug of war, if you will, and we're always in the center of that dialogue. It's always about who we are and about who God is. And our relationships and our lives depend upon us being faithful and attentive and holding one another accountable to these ethical guidelines. Well, you have some questions here in front of you, so I'll give you some time to discuss those. Ask your leader to pause the video, and then in about 6 or 7 seconds, I'll come back and we will conclude our lesson for today. Okay. Next week we're going to begin the Lord's Prayer. I believe I may have had it backward. It might be the Creed. I just realized that I may have this wrong. Well, one or the other. The Creed of the Lord's Prayer. If it's the Lord's Prayer, it will be another lengthy discussion. There are 7 petitions altogether of the Lord's Prayer, plus the preamble and the post-amble, or whatever they call it, the conclusion. And that's going to take some time. I suspect we're not going to get through it on a Sunday morning. We'll do our best. If it's the Creed, well, we'll get through that in fairly good time. It's only 3 videos. So at any rate, thank you for bearing with and hang in there. You'll learn more about the Catechism than you probably want to know, and if you engage in some conversation with some honest friends, you might learn more about yourself and your relationship with God than you thought you knew to as well. So we will see you next week.